and welcome to video number 1 in our 8-video sequence on leadership for resilience and engagement. In this video sequence, we're going to be taking you through a whole bunch of information, evidence-based information from the world, mainly of organisational psychology, about what sponsors resilience and engagement in work groups. And we'll be telling you about the relationship between resilience and engagement. In this video, talking about what is resilience, we'll be talking about why it matters in the next video. We'll be talking about where it comes from, nature and nurture. We'll be giving you some interesting population findings on resilience, and we'll be finishing off with the relationship between resilience and engagement. But first, in psychology, any form of science will do this, we want to define what we mean by resilience. And here's a definition which has stood the test of time. Resilience is held to be a protective factor. In other words, it's something that causes us to be able to cope with the challenges that we face in life more effectively. And this is a definition which was formed in 1996, the general capacity for flexible and resourceful adaptation to external and internal stresses. That's a mouthful, isn't it? But let's pick out the components of what adds up to resilience by virtue of this definition. Firstly, it's a general capacity. In other words, people who are resilient tend not to be resilient in one little pocket. They'll be resilient to a range of things, maybe work-related challenge, social-related challenges, maybe health-related challenges. Resilient people tend to be resilient more broadly. Secondly, we talk about flexible and adaptable. Truly resilient people don't wait for other people to solve their problems. They're able to have agency, a term which is often used in counselling, agency to solve their own problems. And so people who are truly resilient tend not to be victims, they tend to be architects of their own life to a certain extent. We also talk about the fact that people who are truly resilient are able to deal with both internal and external stressors. So an internal stressor could be, this upsets me, or it could be an illness, or it could be, I'm tired. An external stressor could be something like the economy or a pandemic or something which is outside of me. It could be a relationship-related issue. Now, of course, the internal and the external are, of course, closely related, which is to say external stressors become powerful when they become internal stressors. And truly resilient people seem to have the capacity to deflect those external influences and not allow them to damage their well-being quite so much. When there have been catastrophic events, what you'll tend to find is that maybe 70% of the people who've been associated with those catastrophic events are similar level of well-being to what they were before the catastrophic event, or worse. But often somewhere around 30%, of course it varies situation by situation, but often about 30% will be better after the catastrophic event. Now, what do I mean by better? Well, self-report being happier, more confident, more able to deal with things. And so they have grown from the experience. And that's what we call post-traumatic growth. Now, I want to make a really important point about this because people think that in organizations, when an organization sails into tough times, well-being and resilience must decline. That's not true at all. What tends to happen is when an organization sails into tough times, the behaviours of the people within the organisation can change. Now, if they change for the better, in other words, we become more supportive of each other, we become kinder to each other, we become more focused on what we're trying to achieve, we have a good and sensible program of improvement to overcome this challenge, in fact, well-being can increase. If, on the other hand, we sail into tough times and people start acting more badly towards each other, which might be politics or undermining or something like that, then not surprisingly, people's well-being will decline. Now, we have a lot of interest across the world in this thing called psychosocial risk. And psychosocial risk really comes from the psycho bit, comes from psychological outcomes. And the social bit means how people are perceived to be acting around us. So if people act favourably, then we're likely to improve our well-being. If they act badly, we're likely to decline in our well-being. Crafting. Bricolage, as it's sometimes known. Crafting and bricolage is all about the degree to which we are able to make do with what we've got in front of us. Truly resilient people tend to be able to make do with less. And then a lot of people these days talk about this thing called grit, which is often known as the hard edge of resilience. And the idea of grit is where people are able to cope. If they have passion for certain things, that can give them grit. If they have persistence in the face of adversity, that can give them grit. And of course, if we look at things like elite sports, Grit is what matters because you're really in the cauldron of very strong emotions and very high pressure. And what will tend to happen then is that people's performance will decline unless they have grit. Now, one of the things that we know about resilience is that there's an absolutely crucial role to be played by focus. Everybody facing any situation has the choice of what they will focus on. This quote here, it's actually a quote from me, "The secret of life is what you focus on," is really attempting to say, if you focus on things that will help you, you will tend to have higher levels of well-being. If you focus on things that drag your well-being down, you will have lower levels of well-being. And that's demonstrated across the world of therapy. Therapy very often, contemporary methods of therapy such as cognitive behavioral therapy, are all about finding the triggers of what makes you feel bad and finding ways of managing those triggers and also finding positive responses to those triggers rather than negative responses. So what you focus on is absolutely crucial. If you have a positive focus like optimism and positivity rather than pessimism and negativity, then you are much more likely to have high levels of well-being. You'll notice the reference to diary research on the line in the slide. Diary research, what we're talking about there is that groups of people have been asked to keep diaries about what happens to them on a day-to-day basis. And some of them are asked to keep a diary about challenges, the bad things that happen to them. Others are asked to keep diaries about the blessings, the good things that happen to them. If you measure the well-being of those groups before, during and after this exercise, you find that the people who keep the blessings diary actually tend to improve their levels of well-being. So much so that it's not easy to get approval from an ethics committee to do this study if you're going to do the negative diary exercise, because it tends to make people more anxious and depressed. Now, focusing on positive things may raise the question of, are we talking about cockeyed optimism here, an unrealistic perspective that everything's going to be fine? No, I don't think so. There's a term in psychology, self-efficacy. Self-efficacy, the concept of self-efficacy is I will cope. In a group, it's we will cope. So it's not so much optimism about don't worry, everything's going to be fine. It's more a sense of optimism about the fact that we have the capability, we have the strength, we have the teamwork to be able to get through this situation. So good leaders have an optimism and are able to project an optimism. We will get through this. We are good enough to challenge and handle this. And if they do that, that will increase the levels of well-being of staff that they're interacting with. A focus on solutions rather than emotions. Now, it may sound strange from a psychologist to say, look, focusing on emotions is not always a good thing, but it's absolutely true. If you get a group of people together and they talk about how sad they are or how angry they are, we know that that will bring down the levels of well-being of the group. So there's an alternative, and the alternative is to focus on solutions. And people who are highly resilient tend not to be dominated by their emotions. They tend to be able to say, all right, well, this makes me feel sad, but what really is the outcome that I'm seeking to achieve here? And if you can focus on the outcomes, then that will allow you to make a plan to move towards those outcomes, and that in turn tends to generate a sense of optimism, which is one of the most powerful forms of human emotion known. Optimism tends to sponsor creativity, and it tends to sponsor a sense of communal well-being, like an esprit de corps. A focus on the future rather than the past, and most importantly, a focus on what you can control and consciously directing focus away from what you can't control. So if you have a work group that's in tough times, let's say they're struggling in a difficult economy, one of the things that can be really powerful is to ask people in that team, forget the economy. Let's focus on the things that we can do. Can we provide better customer service? Can we market ourselves more effectively? Can we listen to our customers more closely so that we can solve their problems better? Those are things that are under our control, and they tend to create a sense of independence and agency within staff. And agency, as I said before, is this sense that I have an influence on my world. And this diagram really explains this. It's called locus of control. This is an example of an internal locus of control. An internal locus of control says, I believe that control is within me. I can influence my world and I can get better outcomes. The alternative is an external locus of control, which is I believe that control is outside of me, and therefore I really don't have much agency in my world. My world happens to me. Now, many techniques in positive psychology, which are to do with improving levels of resilience, are focused on taking an external locus of control and creating an internal locus of control. The example I gave before about forget about what you can't control and focus only on the things that you can control, that's a resilience building technique which is based on this idea. Let's focus on the things that we can influence and forget the rest. So that's a definition of resilience. In the next video, video number 2, we'll be talking about why it matters. Click on the link near this video to join us for video number 2 in this 8-video series.